To all the Albertan separatists out there, your dreams of a sovereign Alberta, it might be over. So, what just happened? Well, the Albertan courts just deemed the Albertan separatist movement unconstitutional, and the movement might be fully blocked from moving forward. Specifically, this lady right here on the left was the judge in this court case, and she officially deemed it unconstitutional. So, is the movement actually over? Well, kind of. So Danielle Smith has obviously had her problems with this. She kind of has problems with everything, so nobody is surprised. She's called the move anti-democratic and that the voices of 300,000 Albertans are being silenced. So that brings the question of, is separation constitutional? Well, technically, yes, it is. As you will see with Quebec separation, if that vote went their way, they would have separated. It is 100% constitutional as long as you go through the proper steps, which the Albertan separatist movement did not do. They did not consult with the First Nations people. Legally, because this affects the treaties, you have to go through the First Nations people first. And before the petition can even be given to the people to sign, you had to do this first. Funny enough, in December 2025, this exact same ruling was done by this guy right here. And this judge said was that any petition cannot include anything that is unconstitutional, which is exactly what the Albertan separatist movement included. However, Danielle Smith did not appreciate this very much, and so she actually fully rewrote the petition laws so that it's to where you actually can pass a petition that is unconstitutional. This was the only reason why you actually saw like these signature stations where you could go put your signature, was because of this law change from Danielle Smith. Danielle Smith passed this law knowing full well that the First Nations would have never said yes to this. The First Nations never wanted to leave Canada. That is the exact reason why they never consulted with them, because they knew the second they did, that the movement would be over, that the movement would be done. They had said multiple times that they were just going to ask them afterwards, but I feel like we all know that they were lying. So, what are they going to do now? What is their plan moving forward? What is Danielle Smith's plan? Danielle Smith wants to force this question onto the ballot. She wants it October 19th, that people can vote on this and can choose whether or not Alberta stays. However, this will likely depend fully on whether or not the court overwrites the ruling. If not, there's pretty much zero chance that the vote can be on the ballot. The premier does have a lot of power, but something like this is not within their boundaries. I think it's worth thinking about, why is Danielle Smith pushing so hard for this when she has explicitly stated that she doesn't want to see an Alberta that's not a part of Canada. If she said this, why does it matter to her that much that the vote is on the ballot? Well, that brings me to the 2015 vote in Alberta, where the Conservatives were split. Had the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party. They had over 50% of the vote, but because there was two Conservative parties running, the NDPs won. And this is what Danielle Smith is scared of. Danielle Smith is scared of the separatist movement leaving the UCP and then essentially handing Mr. Nenshi over here the job of the Alberta Premier on a silver platter. This is forcing Danielle Smith to essentially try to toe the line between your average fiscal conservative who kind of just wants tax cuts, less regulation, and all these things, and your separatist guy who wants to see an independent Alberta. It's certainly a hard thing to balance, especially because when you look at the separatists, you see a group that is more likely to create their own party, specifically for Alberta independence. You even see it a bit now where people feel like Danielle Smith is not trying hard enough. This is definitely shaking up the Conservative Party quite a bit. But then you also have the fiscal conservatives who are pretty unhappy with what Danielle Smith is doing. However, Danielle Smith is betting on the fact that most conservatives are just not going to vote for the NDP, that they're too scared of the left wing market of the NDP, of the high taxes, social programs, all these things. They don't want to see it. And so she's betting that more than likely, as long as I keep the independent voters happy, then we will not see a split in the conservative vote. However, if it was more like the Liberals in Alberta, we would likely see something similar to the federal election, where a lot of those conservatives are like, okay, you're being dumb, I'm going to vote for the Liberals. However, in Alberta, the Liberals are not a very big party. When only about 30% of Albertans actually want to separate, it's a pretty low number. But when 99% of these people are conservatives, that is a huge chunk of the conservative vote. So obviously, again, Danielle Smith has to prioritize people, or we could see something like this in the next election, where it really is literally the UCP or maybe a different conservative party and like an Alberta Independence Party. I think depending on whether or not she can actually get the vote on the ballot or not will change that. I feel like if she can't, people will go, she didn't try hard enough. And so, depending on how that goes, we could see this guy as the next premier of Alberta, which would be a very interesting thing to see another conservative split vote, especially because in the last 90 years in Alberta, there's only been one premier who wasn't a conservative, Rachel Notley, 2015, which was the exact same thing as what's going on here, where really it's the conservatives' fault for losing the vote. And I think this kind of shows the cracks in the conservatives. I think a lot of your fiscal conservatives are switching towards the Liberal Party because they feel closely aligned with like Mark Carney rather than Pierre. A lot of people were like, Pierre is too extreme. He has too many extreme ideas and he reminds me of Trump. I'm voting for Carney. And that was a pretty common thing to see in Canada. It's the other thing we see it in the US with the Republicans and MAGA, where you have a lot of Republicans from 20 years ago going, what happened to my Republican Party? Like, this is not what I remember Republicans being like. And so I think you are seeing a split, or you're seeing a new movement towards farther right, extreme independence, fully anti-immigration, and you're seeing that globally. And I think it's interesting to see how this is happening in not just countries, not just big countries, but in places like Alberta, where you actually are seeing this far right movement split from the conservatives and possibly into its own party that's a big chunk of the voters. I think it'll be super interesting to see what happens in Alberta. October's right around the corner. And so we will see what happens on the ballot, what's on the ballot, and what the people's reactions are. The Albertan election is in 2027, coming up pretty soon. And so it'll be cool to see what happens, and it'll be interesting to see if the Conservative Party splits and what happens if it does. So I'd like to hear what you think about that, whether you think the courts were justified in their ruling or not. I would really appreciate your thoughts in the comment section down below. And other than that, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Other than that, I'll see you next time.